On the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria of Britain, died at 42 years of age. This German royal consort had made his mark on British history, overseeing projects like the establishment of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Victoria was deeply affected by his death. She spent nearly 40 years constantly dressed in black, the colour worn by mourning widows, and she never remarried. Who was Albert, the man who Victoria mourned so much and who influenced the cultural and political life of 19th century Britain, yet who is so frequently overlooked in accounts of Victorian Britain? This is the story of Prince Albert of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The man known to history as Prince Albert was born Franz August Karl Albert Emanuel to the ruling family of the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld on the 26th of August 1819 at Schloss Rosenau near Coburg in central Germany. His father was Duke Ernst III of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was a member of the senior Ernestine branch of the House of Wettin, a German princely family whose Catholic cousins in the junior branch ruled as electors and kings of Saxony. Ernst had served in the campaigns that led to Napoleon Bonaparte's overthrow in 1814. In July 1817, he married his cousin, Princess Louisa of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, the only child of Duke Emil August, who ruled his duchy from the city of Gotha. The couple had two sons, Ernst and Albert, born in 1818 and 1819. At the time of Albert's birth, the European continent was at peace following 23 years of conflict in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Before Napoleon, the German lands were part of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling imperial entity ruled by the Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. Although the Habsburgs enjoyed full sovereignty over crown lands such as Austria and Bohemia, by the late 18th century they had little political power over the rest of Germany. In 1806, following his decisive victory over an Austro-Russian coalition army at Austerlitz in December 1805, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in western Germany. As master of Germany, Napoleon consolidated the hundreds of principalities into a few dozen more coherent entities. After his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna could not undo his work and instead formed the German Confederation, a collection of some 40 states led by Austria. As a result of these changes, the surviving German dynasties became attractive prospects for European royal houses seeking marriages with princely houses. Saxe-Coburg was among the most ambitious of these families, and over the course of the 19th century, Saxe-Coburg descendants would rule in Belgium, Bulgaria, Russia, Portugal, and Britain. Dynastic ties between the Coburgs and the British royal family were first established in May 1816, when Albert's youngest uncle, Leopold, married Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of the future King George IV of the United Kingdom. Leopold was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and was popular in London. However, before Charlotte could inherit the throne, she died from childbirth in November 1817. Her widowed husband returned to Coburg until 1831, when he accepted the crown of newly independent Belgium. Meanwhile, Charlotte's death left the Hanoverian dynasty at risk of extinction in Britain. George IV's younger brothers had been content to maintain a string of mistresses, but their niece's death led them to seek German wives to produce legitimate heirs. Even before Charlotte's demise, her youngest uncle, Edward, Duke of Kent, had his eye on Leopold's widowed sister Victoria. The couple married in 1818, and in May 1819, the Duchess of Kent gave birth to a daughter named Alexandrina Victoria, the future Queen Victoria. A few months later, Victoria's future husband, Albert, was born at Schloss Rosenau, Duke Ernst's summer residence. Victoria and Albert's fate seemed to be linked from birth. Dr. Charlotte von Siebold, a renowned midwife, assisted at the birth of both babies. Albert was baptized by Pastor Gensler, the Lutheran cleric who had presided over the Duke and Duchess of Kent's wedding ceremony the previous May. Not long after Albert's birth, his parents' marriage began to fall apart. Ernst was frequently unfaithful, and to make up for her husband's neglect, Louisa began flirting with other men, including her brother-in-law, Prince Leopold. It was subsequently rumoured that Leopold was Albert's father, though this theory has never been proved. In 1822, Louisa's father died aged 50, leaving his duchy to his younger brother Friedrich. He had been seriously wounded in the Napoleonic Wars and was not expected to live long. The potential succession of Ernst to the dukedom when Friedrich died was complicated when Louisa left Coburg in August 1824 and abandoned her family in disgust at her husband's affairs. Nevertheless, when Duke Friedrich of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg died in February 1825, Ernst inherited Gotha through Louisa and divorced her shortly thereafter. Louisa married a Prussian officer the following year, but died 5 years later in Paris. Louisa's abrupt departure was undoubtedly a traumatic event in the childhood of the 5-year-old Albert, who remained with his father, now Duke Ernst I of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. While Ernst was a poor husband, he was a cultured man and made sure that his sons were well educated. When they were 4 years old, Ernst appointed Johann Christoph Florschütz as their tutor. The boys studied a wide range of subjects including English, French, Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and science, as well as painting, music, and dancing. The two brothers were particularly close while growing up at Rosenau. By the time they were 10 years old, Ernst and Albert were sitting through 11 hours of lessons from Herr Florschütz every day, from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. While Albert would become highly accomplished in all subject areas, he particularly enjoyed his art and history lessons. In summer 1831, Duke Ernst travelled to London to visit his sister, the Duchess of Kent. The previous year, George IV had died and had been succeeded by his brother, King William IV. While there, Ernst discussed the prospect of his son, Albert, marrying Ernst's niece, Victoria, who was now heir to the British throne. Negotiations on this proposal continued for years to come. Meanwhile, in Germany, Ernst and Albert were being prepared for royal careers at a time when European monarchs were having their powers limited by constitutions and parliaments. In summer 1832, they went to Brussels to visit their uncle Leopold, who had become the first King of the Belgians after the Belgian Revolution of 1830. In 1836, Ernst and Albert were invited back to stay in Brussels for a year. Prior to their departure, Duke Ernst appointed Baron Friedrich Georg Christian von Richmann as their governor. An old soldier who had fought with the Hanoverians under the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, Wichmann was tasked with keeping an eye on the boys. In May 1836, Leopold arranged for them to visit England for the first time. The visit had been prompted by King William IV's decision to invite Prince William of Orange and his sons, William and Alexander, to London with the intention of marrying Victoria off to a Dutch prince. Thankfully for the Coburgers, neither of the Dutch princes made much of an impression on the young Victoria. In a letter of the time, Albert described attending the celebration of Victoria's 17th birthday, during which he briefly exchanged pleasantries with the king and also met with dignitaries such as the Duke of Wellington and Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Conservative Party or Tories. In the same letter, Albert wrote about the ball that accompanied King William's 71st birthday and the trouble he had with the British climate and food. The Coburg princes stayed at Kensington Palace, the residence of Victoria and her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Victoria found her cousins Ernst and Albert far more interesting than the Dutch princes, and she described 16-year-old Albert as handsome. She informed her uncle Leopold that she was willing to marry him, although she did not consider herself bound to do so. Back in Brussels, Albert received a crash course in contemporary European politics from his uncle. Recently married to the daughter of King Louis-Philippe of France, Leopold offered insights into the legitimist and Bonapartist factions that challenged his Orleanist father-in-law, who had been brought to power in Paris by a liberal bourgeois revolution in 1830. In Central Europe, an uprising by Polish revolutionaries seeking to restore their independence had been crushed by the Russian Empire, while the German lands were in a tug-of-war between Protestant Prussia in the north and Catholic Austria in the south. The Austrian Habsburgs were also determined to defeat Italian aspirations for unification, given Austrian control over northern Italy around Milan and Venice. Meanwhile, Spain was paralyzed by civil war between liberal and conservative factions. These revolutionary and nationalist impulses in Europe were accompanied by economic and technological change through the Industrial Revolution. After spending 10 months in Brussels, in April 1837, Albert and Ernst enrolled at the University of Bonn, where they focused their studies on law, politics, and philosophy. A few weeks into his university studies, Albert learned of William IV's death and Victoria's accession in June 1837. While King Leopold and Duke Ernst hurried to London to press Albert's suit, in the autumn the young princes went on a tour of southern Germany, the Swiss Alps, and Venice. In early 1838, they returned to Brussels, where Leopold informed Albert that Victoria was in no hurry to marry. Instead, Albert would return to university, and the question of marriage would be revisited late in 1839. Albert dutifully returned to Bonn, where he studied German constitutional law under Professor Clemens Theodor Perthes, later a member of the Prussian House of Representatives, and philosophy under Emanuel Hermann Fichte, the son of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, an influential philosopher regarded as a father of German nationalism. In accordance with Leopold and Victoria's plans, after 3 semesters at Bonn, Albert prepared to embark on a grand tour of Italy in late 1838. He had to travel without his beloved brother Ernst, who went to the Saxon capital of Dresden for military training. After a difficult journey in the depths of winter, Albert arrived at Florence in January 1839, where he viewed the famed Medici art collections at the Uffizi Gallery and the Pitti Palace. In addition to the native Italian aristocracy, Florence was home to large numbers of Bonapartist and Polish exiles, though Albert was bored by the constant round of balls and preferred to go walking in the mountains with Francis Seymour, an English officer whom Leopold had invited to come to Italy as Albert's travelling companion. After 3 months in Florence, the party moved on to Rome, where Albert marvelled at the splendour of St. Peter's Basilica and discussed the collections of the Vatican Museum with Pope Gregory XVI. Albert's appreciation for Italian art increased under the guidance of Dr. Emil Braun, the secretary of the Prussian Archaeological Institute, who was part of a small community of German cultural intellectuals in Rome. Albert journeyed on to Naples and Pompeii before returning home. He was glad to be reunited with his father and brother in Switzerland ahead of his final summer at Rosenau. In early October, Albert and his brother went to London via Brussels to reinitiate marriage negotiations with Victoria. Although Albert had received reports that Victoria remained hesitant about the prospect of marriage, Victoria fell in love with him after his arrival at Windsor in October. Within days, she asked Albert to marry her. The Queen's announcement of her engagement to her Privy Council in November divided British political opinion. While the governing Whigs were in favour, the Tory opposition was concerned about a German consort. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, had promised Victoria that Parliament would grant Albert an annual allowance of £50,000, but the Tories reduced this to £30,000. Furthermore, Albert struggled to understand the expectations of British elites, and his request to bring his own entourage from Coburg was firmly denied by Melbourne and the Queen. Instead, Albert was obliged to take on Melbourne's private secretary, George Anson, as his own private secretary. After several days of festivities in Coburg and Gotha, Albert and his father and brother left Gotha on the 28th of January and passed through Belgium on their way to England. After arriving at London in February, Albert was named Field Marshal of the British Army. Victoria and Albert were then married on the 10th of February at St. James's Palace and spent a few days at Windsor before returning to London. Historians remain divided on the exact nature of their relationship. Some have portrayed their marriage as a fairy tale romance, but others argue that while Victoria was passionately in love with Albert, the latter regarded the marriage primarily as part of his duty to further his family's dynastic ambitions. In the weeks following his marriage, Albert came to recognize that the English were not expecting him to play an active role in political life, and that he would have no formal title. Nevertheless, Albert was determined to establish a political identity independent of his wife. He chose to do so in a speech on the 1st of June 1840 at Exeter Hall on the Strand, in which he urged the enforcement of the abolition of the slave trade in the Caribbean by military force if necessary. Meanwhile, Parliament passed the Regency Act to designate Albert as regent should Victoria die before the child which she was carrying by then reached their majority. On the 22nd of November, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Victoria, or Vicky, who would be Albert's favourite child. At the same time, Albert was becoming more involved in the realm's politics. During her early reign, Queen Victoria had closely identified herself with Lord Melbourne's Whigs. Albert believed that the Queen should not be so partisan, but he was appalled by the way the Tories insulted her ministers. In June 1841, the royal couple visited the University of Oxford, where Albert received an honorary doctorate in civil law from the Duke of Wellington, the university's chancellor. The old war hero had entered politics after his retirement from the army and led a Tory administration as Prime Minister in the late 1820s. When Wellington invited Albert to attend the annual Waterloo banquet the following week, the prince snubbed him on account of the abuse the Tory students hurled at the Whig ministers during the ceremony. Albert's refusal was a political misstep, and he could not avoid encountering Wellington at other royal engagements. The mistake was more apparent after the Whigs were defeated by the Conservatives in the summer general election. By the time Victoria officially sanctioned Robert Peel's cabinet in September 1841, she was 7 months into her second pregnancy, which led to the birth, in November, of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales and the future Edward VII, known to the family as Bertie. The new Prime Minister found himself increasingly in communication with Albert on matters that required royal attention. Sir Robert was not only impressed by the Prince's political judgment, but also pleasantly surprised to discover Albert's interest in literature and art. Peel accordingly appointed Albert to chair a royal commission to redecorate the new Palace of Westminster, seat of the Houses of Parliament, which was being rebuilt after a fire in 1834 that destroyed much of the medieval palace. While Melbourne had been Victoria's political mentor, Albert turned to Peel for guidance on English constitutional conventions. The Queen also gradually began to warm to Peel. In order to cover the budget deficit he inherited, in 1842 the new Prime Minister revived the income tax that had previously been used to finance military expenditures during the Napoleonic Wars. The tax revenue enabled him to reduce tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, lowering costs for poorer families. Peel also proposed repealing the Corn Laws that protected agricultural interests, although the measure was defeated by Conservative protectionists in the House of Commons. Peel believed that his policies were essential to protect the British Constitution from the wave of radicalism that was sweeping its way across Europe in the 1840s. The Victorian elites cloaked political and economic progress with reassuring throwbacks to the High Middle Ages, casting aside the neoclassicism inspired by Greece and Rome in favour of the Gothic, which was seen as a particularly English style of art and architecture. Accordingly, the new Palace of Westminster was being rebuilt by Sir Charles Barry and the brilliant Augustus Welby Pugin in the Gothic Revival style. Construction began in 1837 and carried on for 2 decades until the completion of the famous clock tower known informally as Big Ben. By giving Albert responsibility over its decoration, Peel not only trusted the prince's artistic judgment, but kept him away from overt political matters. In many ways, the modus vivendi established between Peel, Victoria and Albert created the modern constitutional monarchy in Britain. As a means of addressing concerns that he would import German artists to decorate the British Parliament, Albert launched a competition for drawings and frescoes that was only open to British artists. After the entrance work was exhibited at Westminster Hall in 1843 and 1844, 6 of the artists were commissioned to paint a series of murals on subjects ranging from Caesar's invasion of Britain to King Charles I's raising of his standard during the English Civil War. Away from Westminster, Albert would engage the Saxon artist Ludwig Gruner as his artistic advisor and the architect of several royal projects. Gruner's first commission for Albert was the garden pavilion at Buckingham Palace, inspired by the centrepiece of the Hofgarten in Munich. The structure, which no longer survives, indicates that although Albert was settling into British political life, he continued to see the world through German eyes. As constitutional monarchs, Victoria and Albert played a prominent role on the diplomatic front with foreign visits. In 1843, shortly after the birth of their daughter Alice, the royal couple crossed the Channel to meet with King Louis-Philippe of France at the Château d'Eau in Normandy. Britain and France had recently been involved in a century-long struggle for global hegemony which ended in 1815 with the coalition victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. The old rivals had become friendlier in recent decades, and politicians on both sides of the Channel identified shared foreign policy interests. The royal visit proved a success, and the couple would be invited to the chateau again 2 years later. In November, Albert accompanied Peel on a visit to the factories in Birmingham. The industrial city was a hotbed of radical politics, and politicians in Westminster were concerned about Albert's safety since the royal couple had been targeted by assassins in London the previous year. Despite such fears, the prince was cheered in the streets and became increasingly popular among the masses. Albert's efforts to establish himself in British society prevented him from visiting his German homeland. When he did return home, it was sadly for the funeral of his father, who had died on the 29th of January 1844. Albert travelled to Coburg and stayed with his brother, now Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg Gotha, where they attended a service at the city church where their father had recently been buried. While Victoria and Albert spent most of their time at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, they longed for a summer retreat outside London. The couple had stayed a few times at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, but neither was fond of the eclectic Oriental style conceived there by George IV as Prince Regent. They soon abandoned the property after Peel helped to broker the purchase of Osborne House, overlooking the northern coast of the Isle of Wight. They commissioned the architect Thomas Cubitt to demolish the old house and replace it with a grander Italianate design conceived by Albert. Albert also designed the layout of the gardens and collaborated on the interior design with Ludwig Gruner. As the royal couple oversaw this work, the country was at a political and economic crossroads as Peel attempted to abolish the Corn Laws. The debate had fundamental repercussions on British society. Advocates of repeal tended to be political and economic liberals who supported free trade and the development of industry. Many middle-class businessmen were making large fortunes from trade, which translated into growing political power. From an economic perspective, there was no question that Britain would be better off by shifting towards higher-value industrial production and importing food from abroad. Supporters of the status quo were typically large landowners with agricultural estates who wanted to keep food prices high. To worsen Peel's predicament, a few months later, news reached London that the potato crop had failed in Ireland, leaving much of the island's population with little to eat. Peel was aware of the magnitude of the problem and proposed relief efforts, but he was opposed by his cabinet. Peel resigned in response, but he was forced to stay in office after Whig leader Lord John Russell failed to form a new administration. Albert observed proceedings in the Commons Gallery in January when Peel introduced his proposals to reduce and abolish duties on a whole range of imports, including corn, prompting vociferous attacks from his own benches. After 5 months of debate, the measure passed thanks to overwhelming support from the opposition Whigs. The Tory diehards exacted their revenge on Peel by voting with the Radicals and Irish nationalists against the Irish Coercion Bill intended to keep order on the island as the famine worsened. The minority Peelite Conservatives subsequently allied with the Whigs to form the new Liberal Party. The repeal of the Corn Laws did little to improve matters for the Irish people as the potato crop failed for a second year in 1846. Lord Russell's government organised limited relief efforts that failed to prevent the death of 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. Aside from his colonialist views that were typical of the British political establishment, Albert enjoyed a reputation as a liberal and a man of learning. This prompted the Master of Trinity College to propose his candidacy as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge following the death of the Duke of Northumberland in February 1847. Albert agreed to put his name forward. The Prince was officially inaugurated as Chancellor at Buckingham Palace in March. While the post of Chancellor was largely an honorary position with limited executive functions, Albert would play an active role in the university's administration. With his experience of German university education, Albert recognized that there was much room for improvement at Cambridge, whose students were destined for the law or the church, and teaching was largely restricted to mathematics and classics. In November 1847, Albert reported to Russell that the range of subjects should be expanded. While Russell was cautious about pushing forward with university reform, Cambridge began offering courses in the natural and moral sciences in 1848. Albert's patronage inspired similar reforms at Oxford. 1848 would prove to be one of the most consequential years in European history as a wave of revolutions swept across Europe. Revolutionary activity in Paris forced King Louis-Philippe to abdicate in February and flee to England. In March, Victoria gave birth to her 6th child, a daughter named Louise after Albert's mother, while Albert drafted a plan for a united Germany which he sent to the courts at Vienna, Berlin, Dresden, and Munich. In reality, he had little power to influence events in Germany, where a National Assembly in Frankfurt proposed a German empire with the King of Prussia as its emperor and all the other German sovereigns as his vassals. The proposal horrified Victoria and Albert, as it would entail the subjugation of their German cousins under Prussian rule. In the end, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia rejected the offer of an imperial crown. The royal couple were also anxious about the security of their own crowns, as London witnessed weeks of rioting by the Chartists, who demanded universal suffrage and greater rights for the working class. Albert was sympathetic to radical causes and had agreed to become the president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes, a philanthropic organisation to provide better housing for working-class Englishmen. He had previously supported legislation in Parliament to increase the minimum age for children to work in mines and reduce working hours to 10 hours a day. Such initiatives were designed to correct the excesses of free market capitalism while avoiding the socialist ideology of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who published their Communist Manifesto in London in February 1848. For all his influence as a patron of social housing and a university reformer, Albert resented his lack of genuine political power, which was denied him by Lord John Russell and his Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Albert saw Palmerston's encouragement of Italian, Polish and Hungarian revolutionaries in 1848 as deeply irresponsible. Albert enjoyed greater discretion on purely royal matters, such as the development of the royal retreat at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The Deeside estate had been leased by the diplomat Sir Robert Gordon, who died in 1847 after choking on a fishbone. Gordon was the younger brother of the 4th Earl of Aberdeen, who had recently served as Peel's Foreign Secretary and was friendly with the royal couple. As one of his late brother's trustees, Aberdeen was keen to offload Balmoral and knew that Victoria and Albert were fond of Scotland after their first trip there in 1842. Albert agreed to take on the lease, and in September 1848 the royal family made their first visit to Balmoral. The couple were happy to be back on Scottish soil and enjoyed the privacy it offered. During the rare spells of good weather, Albert enjoyed hunting on the grounds. While in Scotland, they received news of an Irish uprising in the counties of Wexford and Waterford, but this did not deter them from undertaking a royal visit to Ireland in August 1849. While there, Victoria and Albert inaugurated the new Queen's University of Ireland, made up of constituent colleges in the cities of Belfast, Cork and Galway. Unlike Trinity College Dublin, which was solely reserved for Anglican Protestants, the new institution admitted Catholics. Although Albert was impressed by the learning and moderation of the Catholic clergy in Ireland, the royal couple were caught up in renewed anti-Catholic sentiment in England after Pope Pius IX authorised the creation of 12 Catholic dioceses in England. Albert considered the move an existential threat to the Church of England, and Parliament passed a bill making Catholic ecclesiastical titles illegal, though the legislation was never enforced. On the 1st of May 1850, Victoria gave birth to her 7th child and 3rd son. Since the prince was born on the 81st birthday of the Duke of Wellington, he was named Arthur after the elderly Duke, who was one of his godparents. While Victoria and Albert were seeking to situate themselves above the nation's political battles in Parliament, they continued to urge Russell to dismiss Palmerston from the Foreign Office. Palmerston's conduct had irritated a number of foreign governments, and the royal couple were particularly concerned about his stance on the Schleswig-Holstein question. The predominantly German-speaking duchies of Schleswig, Holstein and Lauenburg were ruled by the King of Denmark, but were constitutionally distinct from the Kingdom of Denmark. In 1848, the Prussian-led German Confederation declared war on Denmark. The Danes would prevail in a 3-year conflict, but Victoria and Albert worried that Palmerston's support for Denmark was antagonizing the German powers. Arguing that British foreign policy should be guided by British national interests, Palmerston defended himself from critics in a lengthy parliamentary speech in June 1850. A few days later, Robert Peel died after falling from his horse, depriving the royal couple of a trusted confidant. Meanwhile, the Queen and Albert continued to express their dissatisfaction with Palmerston's foreign policy. The Foreign Secretary temporarily survived in office, but was forced to resign in December 1851 after sending a private telegraph congratulating Prince Louis Napoleon, who had been elected President of the Second French Republic in 1848, on the coup d'etat that ultimately led to him becoming Emperor Napoleon III of France. While Albert was plotting against Palmerston, he was also working on a grand project to promote British industry. Although the Industrial Revolution was making Britain wealthy, Industrialization was opposed by many people across the political spectrum, from hardline conservative grandees who resented the desecration of the English countryside to labour agitators who highlighted the exploitation of workers by the new industrial bosses. Albert embraced industrial growth, and since 1843 had been president of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. From 1845, several prominent society members began discussing plans for a national exhibition of British arts and manufactures along the lines of the Paris expositions that had been held sporadically since the early 1800s. The idea was first suggested by telegraph pioneer William Fothergill Cooke and soon received the backing of Liberal politician Charles Wentworth Dilke and Henry Cole, a civil servant credited with the invention of the postage stamp and Christmas card. By 1849, the Society announced its ambition to hold a British national exhibition in 1851 and established a committee, chaired by Cole, for the purpose. Albert recognized that the exhibition combined his interests in art and technology and agreed to be its patron in June 1849. He quickly assumed a leading role in its organization and became president of the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851. The Prince believed that it should not only showcase British products, but should be an international event promoting free trade and the unity of mankind. He led the fundraising for the project and travelled throughout the country to appeal to bankers and merchants. One of the Royal Commission's most important tasks was the construction of the exhibition building. While many different sites across London were discussed, Hyde Park was the obvious choice for the venue, although the suggestion faced opposition in Parliament and in the press. In spring 1850, the Commission set up a building committee, including luminaries like the engineers Isambard Kingdon Brunel and Robert Stevenson. Since all the proposals they received were deemed unsuitable, the committee devised a squat brick structure crowned by a massive iron dome designed by Brunel. The proposal horrified Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect known for his work on the Duke of Devonshire's landscape garden at Chatsworth House. Paxton had built a great conservatory made from standardized glass panes supported by a structure of iron and wood, and his familiarity with the construction techniques led him to draw up plans for a vast glass building 6 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral that would cost only £88,000 to build. After the building committee's design was publicly ridiculed, the Commission accepted Paxton's proposal in July with Albert's backing. The prefabricated structure, nicknamed the Crystal Palace, was completed by February 1851. English manufacturers responded eagerly to the opportunity to exhibit their wares to the world, some of which were personally commissioned by Albert. Large collections were being assembled from Persia, China, the United States and other parts of the world for what would become an iconic event in the history of the British Empire. Ahead of the exhibition's opening, there were concerns about the threat of violence against visiting dignitaries by various groups of political dissidents. Since the Queen was due to open the exhibition, the organisers planned to restrict the opening ceremony to the diplomatic corps, but the royal couple pressed for a less exclusive event. As Albert's wife opened the exhibition on the 1st of May 1851, the Queen was awestruck by the magnificence of the Crystal Palace and its interior decoration. She accompanied Albert past an audience of 24,000 onlookers without any issue. Victoria would return to the exhibition over 30 times, and the event attracted over 6 million visitors in the 5.5 months between May and October 1851. For all of Albert's idealistic notions of universal peace and prosperity, the event was also a statement of British imperial power, as one of its most popular exhibits was the Koh-i-Noor diamond seized from the 11-year-old Maharaja Dulip Singh in 1849 and presented to the Queen in 1850. The exhibition's ticket sales generated a profit of £186,000, which Albert used to finance the construction of a cultural complex to the south of Hyde Park, nicknamed Albertopolis. The Prince personally inspected the ground where building work was to take place and offered advice on the interior decoration of the South Kensington Museum, which opened in June 1857 and was later rebuilt as the Victoria and Albert Museum. To consolidate his legacy as a patron of the arts, Albert launched an initiative in 1853 to document every single work of art by the Renaissance master Raphael, building on the collection of prints inherited from George III and George IV. Like the Raphael collection, Albert's vision of Albertopolis was only realized after his death. The Royal College of Chemistry, founded in 1845 and patronized by Albert, merged with the Royal School of Mines in 1853 and moved to South Kensington in 1872 to form the core of Imperial College London. The Royal Albert Hall, the concert venue dedicated by Victoria to Albert's memory, was inaugurated in 1871. The Natural History Museum opened in 1881, and the Royal College of Music in 1883. Albert was one of Britain's great royal patrons of art and culture. In September 1852, during Victoria and Albert's annual visit to Balmoral, the couple received news of the Duke of Wellington's death. Albert organised the Duke's state funeral, a grand spectacle during which the late Duke's body was transported in a funeral carriage from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea to the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. The victory at Waterloo had brought Britain and Europe several decades of relative peace and tranquility, but Wellington recognised that the British Army needed reform at the dawn of an age of industrialised warfare. A few years earlier, the Duke had suggested that Albert should succeed him as Commander-in-Chief and lead the necessary reforms. Albert declined, and Wellington was succeeded by the uninspiring Lord Hardinge, an old soldier who had served under Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars and had been Governor-General of India a few years earlier. The restoration of the French Empire by Napoleon III prompted fears of renewed hostilities with France, England's perennial enemy. While the spectre of war was indeed on the horizon, British and French soldiers would fight side by side when it broke out. The spark for this was the outbreak of a fresh war between the Russian and Ottoman empires during their long-running rivalry in the Black Sea, Caucasus and Balkans. The Russian Black Sea Fleet sank an Ottoman squadron at Sinope on the northern coast of Turkey in November 1853. As the war developed, concerns grew in London and Paris that the Russians would seize Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, inflaming British opinion. While Albert believed Britain could secure its foreign policy objectives without going to war, the popular Palmerston, back in government as Home Secretary, demanded action. After formally joining the war against Russia in March 1854, in September nearly 60,000 British and French troops landed on the Crimean Peninsula and laid siege to the port of Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Meanwhile, Albert met with Napoleon III in France to consolidate the alliance between the former rivals. The Crimean War soon highlighted the inadequacies of both armies. Public opinion quickly turned against the war as war reporters and photographers documented the death, destruction, and incompetence of the Allied military leadership, exemplified by the infamous charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava. In January 1855, the Queen reluctantly acknowledged that only Palmerston could command a parliamentary majority as Prime Minister. After Sevastopol finally fell in September 1855, the new Russian Tsar Alexander II sued for peace, which was signed in March 1856. Although the British and French had temporarily prevented Russia's expansion into the Balkans, both sides suffered awful casualties. To recognize the courageous exploits of individual soldiers, in February 1856, Victoria instituted the Victoria Cross with the inscription, "For Valour." The performance of the respective armies in the Crimean War provided vital intelligence to the Prussians, who determined that Britain would be incapable of resisting a further armed attempt to resolve the Schleswig-Holstein question in their favour. While the war was ongoing, Victoria and Albert received Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia at Balmoral in 1855. The 23-year-old prince was the nephew of the childless Prussian king and would eventually succeed to the throne as Friedrich III. Victoria and Albert were determined that their eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, would marry the Prussian prince. Friedrich's visit in 1855 formalized their engagement, and the couple were married in January 1858. A few months before the wedding of her eldest daughter, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Beatrice, the last of her 9 children. While the Queen's regular pregnancies indicated that the couple were passionately devoted to each other, the royal couple were also prone to frequent arguments, and Albert struggled to cope with Victoria's mood swings. In the royal household, Albert was an absolute monarch, even though he had no formal English title. Since their marriage, Victoria had repeatedly urged her ministers to grant her husband a title, but the Westminster politicians were wary of Albert's political ambitions and repeatedly refused the request. They were finally forced to act, as the couple's eldest son was approaching adulthood and would outrank his father on official occasions as Prince of Wales. In June 1857, the Privy Council finally agreed to grant Albert the title of Prince Consort rather than King Consort. The same year witnessed a major upheaval in India as Indian soldiers rebelled against British rule. Britain had hitherto exercised its authority in India through the East India Company, but after the Indian Mutiny, the British Crown took formal control of India. While Albert welcomed the centralisation of imperial power in London, he was increasingly concerned by the militaristic turn in Prussia. He hoped that his beloved daughter Vicky would strengthen the cause of liberalism in Berlin. His hopes would be dashed. Although Prince Friedrich shared his wife's liberal attitudes, he was incapable of standing up to his autocratic father, who became King of Prussia in 1861 and Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany in 1871. By the time Friedrich succeeded to the throne in 1888, he was dying and ruled for only a few months before his son Wilhelm II succeeded him. Albert bitterly regretted the departure of his favourite child, and in May 1858 he went to Germany to revisit Coburg and call on his daughter in Berlin. While Albert could find no fault with his eldest daughter, he was less impressed by his eldest son and namesake. Although Bertie was growing up to be a charming young man, he was a poor student and did not share his father's interest in history and art. In October 1859, Bertie began his university studies at Christ Church College, Oxford, but his academic performance failed to impress his parents. Aside from the Prince of Wales, Albert had plenty of other worries in 1859. Across the Atlantic, the United States was heading towards civil war, while in Asia, British soldiers were fighting alongside the French to expand their trading privileges with the declining Qing Empire in China in the Second Opium War. In Europe, Napoleon III offered military support to the Italian nationalists in their struggle to push the Austrians out of northern Italy. The British public favoured the Italian cause, but Victoria and Albert remained neutral and doubted the viability of an independent Italian state. Meanwhile, Albert received regular updates on German affairs from his daughter Vicky in Berlin. The Queen and Prince Consort were planning another German match for their daughter Alice, this time with Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt. After accompanying her parents to Germany in September 1860, Alice's engagement with Louis was formalized in April 1861. The marriage was a happy one, though Alice would die in her mid-30s, while her daughters Elizabeth and Alix would marry into the Russian Romanov dynasty and fall victim to the Bolsheviks many years later. Amidst political crises at home and abroad, Albert often suffered bouts of illness. By late 1860, he was suffering from shivering fits and vomiting, symptoms of Crohn's disease. Although he had a weak constitution since childhood, Albert worked hard throughout his life, spreading his energies across a wide range of issues and interests. While Albert was ill, Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, was diagnosed with cancer and died in March 1861. The Queen suffered a psychological collapse and often directed her angry outbursts at her husband. Meanwhile, Albert was preoccupied with many issues, including the continued uncertainty over Schleswig-Holstein and the prospects of the Prince of Wales, two issues which he hoped to address at a single stroke. In 1860, Albert had arranged for Bertie to visit North America, where the prince was greeted with unexpected enthusiasm by the American crowds. Albert was nevertheless disappointed by reports of his son dancing late into the night and flirting with actresses, and in 1861 he arranged for his transfer to Trinity College, Cambridge, where his academic performance improved under the supervision of Charles Kingsley, Regius Professor of Modern History. Albert also formed plans for Bertie to marry Princess Alexandra of Denmark. By connecting the British royal family with their Prussian and Danish counterparts through marriage, Albert believed that Prussia would avoid going to war with Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein. In September 1861, Bertie travelled to Germany, where his sister Vicky arranged for him to meet with Princess Alexandra. In November, Albert learned that days before meeting the Danish princess, Bertie had spent 3 nights with the actress Nellie Clifton while undergoing military training at the camp at the Curragh in Ireland. Albert was shattered by the revelations which brought to mind the scandals involving his father and his mistresses during his youth. This undermined the efforts he and Victoria had made over 2 decades to present the royal family as a respectable institution. Albert immediately wrote a lengthy letter chastising his son and travelled to Cambridge to talk to him 2 weeks later. While Bertie apologised for his behaviour and reconciled with his father, the visit worsened Albert's fragile health. By the start of December, Albert was unable to eat, although he mustered the energy to draft a message defusing the Trent affair, a diplomatic incident during the American Civil War where the US Navy stopped the British mail ship RMS Trent and took 2 Confederate envoys captive. On the morning of Sunday the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert died at the age of 42, leaving behind the distraught Queen Victoria, who famously continued to wear black in mourning for her late husband throughout the remaining 40 years of her life. The Queen commissioned a royal mausoleum at nearby Frogmore for herself and Albert, which was richly decorated by Gruner, taking inspiration from Albert's Raphael collection. A more public memorial to Albert can be seen in Kensington Gardens across from the Royal Albert Hall. Commissioned by Victoria and designed by George Gilbert Scott, the Albert Memorial takes the form of an elaborate Gothic canopy surrounded by allegorical sculptural groups and friezes depicting musicians, poets, architects, painters and sculptors. The memorial was inaugurated in 1872, and the golden seated figure of Albert was placed underneath the canopy 3 years later in 1875. The statue overlooks one of his greatest legacies, the collection of cultural institutions in South Kensington financed by the Great Exhibition. Today, Albert is remembered as a figure who embodied the political and economic developments of the mid-19th century that laid the foundations for the largest empire the world has ever known. However, Albert himself had grander ambitions to play an active role in British political life, and his vision for peace in Europe crumbled after his death as Prussian armies forged the German Empire with blood and iron through 3 successful wars against Denmark, Austria and France between 1864 and 1871. Several decades later, the subjects of Albert's grandsons, Kaiser Wilhelm II and King George V, were facing each other across the blood-stained battlefields of the First World War. What do you think of Prince Albert? Does he deserve his reputation as a liberal reformer who patronised the arts and sciences and brought the British royal family into the modern age? Or was he too naive in seeking to forge European unity through dynastic alliances in an age of nationalism? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.